Happy Friday, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dave Conley, again, your host with Straight Talk Live. Today, we're joined by truly two of the giants in the suicide prevention world. We have Dr. David Rudd, who for a while there was also the president of the University of Memphis. We have Dr. Bryan, who also is with David, is known by everybody. He runs a bunch of programs out of the Ohio State University. Craig, what is your official title? I know it's a really long one.
Yeah, I've got a few, but I guess the most important one is I'm the stress, trauma, and resilience professor.
Okay, so that makes you the big boss of all the suicide prevention, resilience, peer. Okay, gotcha.
Supposedly.
And David, what's your title now? Or Dr. Rudd, sorry.
I'm a distinguished university professor of psychology and president emeritus.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining us today. We've got a lot of great stuff to cover, and just having you two says a lot for what we're doing. We really, truly appreciate your time and look forward to getting to know you better. Let's start out with just a little bit. David, Dr. Rudd, do you want to talk about who you are? Spend a couple of minutes just talking about the different things that you're doing so we can kind of get a feel for that.
Yeah. So like Craig, I'm a former military, so I served in the Army during the Gulf War, was a 2nd Armored Division psychologist. I've been working, even though I've been in university administration as a dean, provost, and president for almost 2 decades now, I've continued to be active in research in clinical practice work over the course of the years, and specifically around treatment and clinical management of suicide risk, specifically those experiencing significant suicidal ideation, as well as making suicide attempts. And so most of the work that I've been involved with has been around those areas about treatment and assessment and clinical management, Dave.
Now, and most of your work is military and veteran communities, correct?
It is, yeah. Most of it is military and veteran related. That's correct. Uh-huh.
Okay. And Dr. Bryan, can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on doing?
Yeah, sure. So as Dr. Rudd mentioned, I also served in the military. I've been out for about 12 years now. I was in the Air Force, deployed to Iraq in 2009. And since separating from the military, have moved into academia and done mostly DoD-funded research focused on suicide prevention, developing treatments and prevention strategies. A lot of that work has been done with David Rudd, and we have a new program here at the Ohio State University that we call STRIVE, which stands for Suicide and Trauma Reduction Initiative for Veterans. So we have a lot of service members and veterans come to us here in Ohio to receive treatment for PTSD and suicide risk, but we also have a very active telehealth program as well, so that actually the majority of service members and veterans we work with, we're doing virtual remote treatment and therapy with, so we can reach them wherever they are at.
Now, when you say telehealth, is that telehealth is in regard to STRIVE? Is that what you're?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as a part of the STRIVE program, we are conducting multiple research studies that are really focused on trying to improve the effectiveness of existing treatments so that we can, kind of hopefully help service members and veterans get better faster, help more veterans, a larger percentage of veterans respond to treatment. And so a big part of that is delivering the therapies in this sort of virtual remote platform, very similar to us. We use Zoom, we use Teams, other platforms as well. And so we're able to reach out and work with service members and veterans kind of regardless of where they're located.
And I got to say, as you know, I went through the Strive program personally, and I loved it. First, I hated it. The first couple of days, I was cursing you and Dr. Rudd and everybody who told me to go there. But then, as I kept going, I finally that epiphany of what the hell you're doing, why you're doing what you're doing, and making me relive the same thing. It hit me, and it's like, oh, okay, well, it's not that bad. I won't quit yet. And then by the end of the first week, I was like, okay, this is all right. So, and I know a lot of the people that we've referred your way, and everybody's got really great stories about how well it works. The combination of the program and the Stella ganglion block, they were just huge. And I know a lot of the people who sent it have actually said, hey, it changed my life. So what you guys are doing is working. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
Before we get going into all the heavy suicide prevention part, there's two questions that we keep getting asked. We've got a lot of really senior military leaders on here. We've got some senators, government officials, DOD. And one of my that we really have been getting hit with a lot is, what is causing, and I know this is out of your expertise, but you're both psychologists, the extreme drop in recruitment to the military?
I think it's probably not any single issue, and there's a pretty good history showing that military recruitment tends to ebb and flow based on kind of how the economy is doing. And so during times when unemployment is higher, when the economy is in a slump, we tend to see more people joining military. Incidentally, those are often times when people also will go back to school and kind of pursue these other activities, oftentimes because they're facing sort of economic hardship. And so in the past couple of years, the economy has started to, improve quite a bit after the peak of COVID. And so I think that's one issue that's probably at play. And I think that, with the drawdown and withdrawal from Afghanistan and kind of a shift to a different form of ops tempo, I think maybe the idea of what it means to serve in the military maybe is not at the forefront of the American public's mind like it was when we were in active military operations overseas.
Yeah, I would really echo what Dr. Bryan said, Dave. In the issue of 20 years of combat and with changes in expectations when you have a drawdown and a significant withdrawal, particularly from Afghanistan, a significant challenge, and the economy's been doing well. The other thing you may want to layer in is there have been a lot of programs nationally supporting students going back to college and to technical schools. And so there have been a lot of states that have made it free to go to community college, technical school, and more accessible in terms of education. And there used to be a significant portion of those that are going into the military for educational benefits. Those are available elsewhere now as well. So it complicates the picture a little bit.
So you guys don't see it as being an issue with, I know when I went in, I'm sure the two of you, I almost specifically went in because I just wanted to serve. I didn't care about the education benefits. I mean, I did once I got there, of course, and learned about them. But so you don't think that that's we kind of lost that motivation to serve my country? Well, I mean, there's, we see a lot of turmoil every day politically, and not even politically, everywhere. Do you think that's affecting what we're doing? And if so, how do we fix it?
I wouldn't propose to know how to fix it. I would tell you, though, that fewer and fewer people serve. I mean, the one thing I worry about personally is probably consistent with what you said, is that fewer people are familiar with what it means to serve in the military. There's not a mandatory requirement for military or public service. And as fewer families serve, there are fewer generations that are aware of the importance of it. In the need for it. I certainly would join you in being concerned.
Yeah, that is the hard part for me, is just figuring out how we relight that fire again that drives people to want to go in. So, but again, I realize that's out of your out of your guys' wheelhouse, a specialty, but I just thought, maybe we can get some ideas here. So, big question. The number one question that we get every day is, why are the numbers still climbing? I mean, I know the VA came out here recently and said 2020 declined a bit, but we all knew during COVID, for whatever reason, suicides pretty much dropped off the map for most of it. So that wasn't anticipated. Do you guys believe that the overall numbers are still going to show down, or are we still climbing?
My sense of things is that probably the rates will at least hold steady for the foreseeable future. And I think it will probably continue that trend until, the DoD makes some pretty substantial changes to how it goes about doing the suicide prevention, but also just, I think a lot of organizational factors actually sustain elevated suicide rates. And what kind of stood out to me over the past several years when we saw it, at least in the U.S. general population, a slight decline in suicides that was not matched by the DoD rates, that kind of signaled to me that perhaps there's something about the institution or the organization itself that carries risk that is, not shared by the larger population. And so some of what we've learned in the past years and the past months in particular, doing a lot of site visits at various military installations, is that there oftentimes are policies and practices and traditions within the military that are arguably out of date with modern society. We know that with the advances in technology in particular, life is very fast-paced, and the DoD is anything but fast-paced. And so there's perhaps some older cultural issues within the DoD that have not sort of kept up with an evolving society, and the consequences of that can be, increased stress on a day-to-day basis for service members. We've also just kind of encountered and seen just a lot of, again, institutional barriers of kind of the way that rules, policies are written that inadvertently perhaps get in the way of quality of life and make life perhaps more difficult than it needs to be for the average service member.
You mentioned something that I would like to lead into. And one area that, I'm no expert, and I don't claim to be at all, but there's so much technology out there for suicide prevention. And it doesn't seem that as far as I'm seeing, we're utilizing it that much. We're using, we're still on gatekeeper programs rather than the direct, I don't know what you want to call them, direct counseling, direct peer, whatever you call them. What kind of technology do we have coming that these senior leaders can employ to really start, reducing these numbers?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things, and then love to hear a little more about what Dr. Bryan thinks as well. Certainly the reach of services through telehealth is increased dramatically. And I think, his programs are an excellent example of that. Some of the work that we're doing together on translating empirically informed treatments into digital applications that don't require you to travel, don't require you to have face-to-face access to a clinician. You can do it in a handheld device, improve access, and we're readily testing, the effectiveness of that. I think a part of the challenge, Dave, is it's not just the technology, but it's actually testing the effectiveness of the technology and then getting adequate coverage to pay for the use of technology through insurers. Some of the bureaucracy that Craig mentioned about the DoD in terms of its relationship to making life more difficult than it has to be. There are a lot of institutional things in the federal government, like FDA approval, that if you want to provide insurance coverage for digital services, they require that kind of federal approval and oversight that literally take years to get through, and really complicates our ability to expand access and make it more readily available. So it's some of what Craig was talking about around DoD bureaucracy is about federal government bureaucracy in general and the oversight and management of healthcare. So there's some of these things that are above really the clinician level or local institution level.
So is there, Dr. Bryan, did you want to kick in there before I keep on going on another tangent?
I think, I agree completely. And I think maybe one sort of addition is this notion of, kind of compliance and oversight. And so, outside of the DoD, for instance, working in, a private sector healthcare system, what we found over the past several years is, most medical services, or at least a good portion of medical services, transition to virtual delivery, telehealth. It's interesting because now a lot of the sort of exceptions and waivers that were provided by regulatory bodies, state agencies, government agencies are in essence expiring. We're being rolled back to pre-COVID business as usual. And interestingly, we've found like our patient population here in Central Ohio, they don't want to go back to what it was before. They said, I have faster access. It's easier access. I don't have to drive across town. I don't have to spend 20 minutes trying to find a parking spot. I don't have to pay for parking. There are all these benefits to, technology facilitated medical services. But unfortunately, I think right now the momentum in many cases is to kind of go back to the way things were before. And I'm not sure that that's actually the best way to go about doing things. And in the DoD, my experience is that was magnified in the early stages of COVID a few years ago. The work that I was doing in collaboration with DoD medical facilities, they really struggled to quickly adapt to the realities of this sort of new pandemic. And I think even now, a few years later, sometimes it's sort of like my experiences, a lot of the MTFs just haven't really ever kind of caught up. And I think that's going to be a big limitation for the DoD moving forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And Dave, I would add to that, the traditional dropout rates in treatment, are in the 25 to 30% range. And so there's enough treatment hesitancy as it is. And one of the nice things about digital or telehealth access is it reduces those barriers that are just everyday barriers. It's not really about people not wanting to be in care, but it's about having to get in a car, drive, travel, all of the additional sacrifices you have to make that have real significant implications for people's lives around access to care. And sometimes that gets lost in bureaucracy and we forget or minimize the significance of those things. I tell you, digital therapeutics offers a great alternative that if you can overcome some of the bureaucratic tedium of it and get broader approval, will continue to have significant impact and around suicidality as well. I mean, a couple of things Craig and I are doing now are around digital therapeutics. And so I do think it has great promise.
I wanted to add real quick as well, another consideration that we ran into, because we've been mostly focusing on like institutional barriers, but I've been struck over the past year, the sort of limited awareness that many service members and veterans have about technology facilitated healthcare. And so, right now, for instance, the DoD is like many other agencies suffering from a shortage of behavioral health providers, which is limiting access for service members. But when we talk with many service members about the possibilities of telehealth or virtual remote delivered mental health care services, many of them actually had not heard of that before. They were skeptical about the effectiveness of the treatment, even though, decades of research has shown, a virtual format like this is just as good as face-to-face traditional therapy. And so I think another aspect around this issue is I don't think we've done a good enough job as a community talking about the options that are available. And it might be the case that a given person might not prefer telehealth. That's okay. But there are others who would say, all things being equal, if I can meet with someone this week, I would absolutely do it instead of waiting a few weeks. And so I think we need to do a better job of marketing around this to let the community know that there are these different ways of receiving healthcare services. They all seem to work equally well, but probably they're going to be well suited to different types of people based on their personal preferences and their conditions in life. And so providing a broader menu of options, I think will improve the quality of care for everybody, which will have a net benefit for the community.
Dr. Rudd, I want to go back a little bit to something you said, and that was digital treatment without a provider, or the treatment. Are we talking about the same telehealth that Dr. Bryan's talking about? Or are we actually talking about an app telling me that I'm not nuts?
No, I think there are two different options. The telehealth option traditionally utilizes a clinician, just like this environment, in a Zoom or a Teams or some other kind of environment where you're conversing and interacting with a clinician. But there are some digital therapeutics, and we're testing one now and getting ready to launch another test around the effectiveness of a digital therapeutic that doesn't necessarily involve a clinician, but uses AI and bot-related interactions that is predominantly psychoeducational in nature to look at whether or not it has meaningful, significant impact. So that you don't necessarily have to interact with a clinician, that there are some of those options out there, and we're going to have more data in the very near future about the overall effectiveness of those and whether or not they have the kind of value that we hope that they do.
Yeah, okay. So then it's both, really. I mean, there's a telehealth version, but there's an app that, wow, okay. Here's the next question that was coming up is, what can senior leaders do to make the biggest impact in the shortest time? And it sounds like you're summarizing that basically with what we're talking about here. I was talking to SEAC this morning, and they're all heading to Alaska, still working on the suicide prevention up there. Their biggest problem has always been a lack of personnel up there, a lack of the clinicians, basically. I mean, I know now they're doing the care, I think it's called Care 100, where they're bringing in a bunch. But, still, if they had an app like that, where they can offer both, that might really cut down that shortage in a big way. Are you to a point where they can use that kind of technology, or is it still on the drawing board?
Well, it's available for use. It doesn't have FDA approval, but I would reinforce something that Craig said earlier that I think was really important, and that's the issue that aside from access to care and effective treatments, there are a lot of things that leaders can do about culture that change the livability of somebody's current circumstance. I mean, there is bureaucratic things, policies, practices that are in place that make it difficult for people, independent of access to treatment, access to care. I think those are two different avenues to pursue. And certainly you get at a third, which is just general stigma around. And I'd love to hear Craig's thoughts about really separating these as separate targets. That we're really talking about related problems, but in many ways distinct problems.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, some of what has been most striking to me in the past couple of years with the work that I've been doing is the importance of quality of life issues. And I think this really comes into sharp relief in the military, where we often think about, things like the quality of housing, the availability of service members to take leave on a regular basis when they want, affordability of housing, being paid in a timely manner, being reimbursed in a timely manner. All of these things are actually, they're kind of like little annoyances and daily hassles, but they really grind people down. And so interestingly, of late in the past year, when we go around, we ask service members, like, what's the most stressful thing for you in your life? Surprisingly, the most common answer was our computers. It takes like 40 minutes for our computers to load in the morning, and they don't connect to the printers, and the email doesn't work, and I can't join, virtual meetings, and the email is down on a regular basis. And it seems like so, benign, but yeah, these are the things on a day-to-day basis that really kind of impact your ability to do your job. And when you can't say, get your job done in a timely manner, then you have to stay late afterwards to finish your job. You have to do this on top of your other assigned duties. So it can affect family relationships, it can affect your finances. And so all of these things kind of accumulate. And we've been really struck by, from a leadership perspective, when leadership recognizes those problems and solve those issues, those little things on a day-to-day basis, it actually has a very disproportionate effect on the morale of service members. And I think it's because it's symbolic. It communicates to the service member that you matter, that this little thing is worth attention, resources, and time to make your life better, because you're worth it. And I think that often gets sort of thrown to the side as like, oh, it's just not important. That's not what suicide prevention is about. And we get a little bit too focused, as David mentioned, on like the mental health aspect of things. But it really is, I think, these quality of life things on a day-to-day basis that most commanders do have some direct control over, and they could be pulling those levers and making, I think, a bigger difference in their people's lives than perhaps they realize.
And the other thing that I would add to what Craig said, that I think in everything he talked about, and I agree completely, it's not warrior culture. It's just culture. And I mean, it's just work-life culture that is not unique to warrior culture that creates these little nuances that, if you look at some theories, they talk, kindling theory around this, that it creates the spark, and that ultimately accumulates over time that generates the significant stress. But the little things within culture, period. And that's not unique to the military. I would argue that is in any institutional culture where you find problems, you find those little things. Because a lot of times I think people worry about the influence of warrior culture specifically. So it's an interesting problem and an interesting issue. And certainly, I think maybe a little more easy to address than we might have anticipated if you can recognize those little things.
Well, isn't it true that, and I think, Dr. Bryan, this came from you guys, that less than half of the suicide actually have a mental health component?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, those data have kind of existed for as long as we've been monitoring statistics. I mean, you can look at CDC data for, years, if not decades, and see that, around half of those in the United States who die by suicide do not have a mental health condition. It's certainly true in the military. If you look at DODSR data, you see a very similar pattern. And I think we've long kind of interpreted those statistics as evidence of stigma, right? So because people have mental health stigma, they don't go to get treatment, and therefore they're never diagnosed. And so that large group of people who die without a mental health condition, they actually do have a mental health condition we just don't know about. It's never been documented. But if you kind of look critically at decades of published research, I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests that no, actually, there's a significant percentage of people who perhaps are experiencing severe life distress, relationship problems, financial strain, legal issues, and they have these very extreme reactions. They get stressed really fast, they get overwhelmed, and particularly if they have access to a highly lethal method like a loaded weapon, that transient temporary moment of despair is weaponized. And if you think, most of us have experienced this before. We've lost our temper, we've lost our cool, we've said something that we later regretted, we made a decision that we wish we could take back. I think for many people, this is how they experience suicide risk. And it doesn't require a mental illness to have those types of natural human responses. But it does highlight the importance of, if this does happen, if people can go from 0 to 60 very quickly, then we probably need to think about other strategies to prevent suicide that don't rely upon identification of warning signs, referral to mental health. And this is where a lot of the work that David and I have been doing focused on things like secure firearm storage and other such strategies can actually be perhaps one of the more important things we could do to prevent suicide.
And overcoming the treatment hesitancy has to be huge either way for that other half that is mental health related. I know even myself, that was the scariest part about talking to you, Dr. Bryan, about joining that thing is I knew I had to talk to someone I didn't know. And I don't care how tough you are, that's scary to get down and say, hey, this is killing me. And I don't know you, but I'm going to tell you all about it. So, I think we really, that's an answer to the question on what can leaders do. It sounds like it's more about just taking these little steps, little corrective steps to bring that unit cohesion back into place. And then the other things that we're already doing, and we've got all the trainings and all that out of the way. So let's start picking and choosing which battles these senior leaders can actually win.
And leaders, leaders have a very significant role in helping undermine stigma around talking very plainly about the reality of the need for healthcare, the reality of when a problem becomes, it reaches a point where you need professional assistance, the importance of doing that earlier rather than later. I'm sure Dr. Bryan's had the same experience I've had in working with people that if they had pursued intervention a year earlier, it would be far quicker and far more effective. It gets far more complicated the longer you wait. If you look at post-trauma data in this country or internationally, the delay time in general trauma before pursuit of care is about 11 years in the U.S., which is stunning. And so you take an acute problem that would respond very quickly and effectively to intervention. You wait a decade to pursue treatment, it is a much more complicated chronic problem and much more difficult to treat. And it's usually coupled with other problems like secondary substance abuse. And there are a host of things that complicate the picture. Leaders can help diffuse that by encouraging people to pursue resources and availability of care, and that it doesn't represent any kind of personal failure. It doesn't represent any kind of personal shortcoming, any kind of personal weakness, that it really is about individual strength and courage, and that ultimately, under certain conditions, everyone has significant, sharp emotional responses. That's part of being human. And sometimes it is difficult in warrior culture to acknowledge that.
The hardest part. I had a conversation the other day because I still get a question, am I going to lose my clearance if I ask for help? And, while we know that was certainly the case for a lot of years, I know that the DOD's gone out of their way to really kind of put that buffer in between maybe temporarily suspending or what have you, rather than pulling clearances or not at all, just getting help as long as you're getting help. What have you two found out about that or heard about that? Are they doing a good job at protecting the clearances or are they going?
Yeah, I think the DoD has made some progress. I think, there's some more work to be done in the space. Some of in the past year or two, the DoD has been working really hard to message some of their own findings that, something like 99% of those who seek out mental health care voluntarily do not experience duty limiting conditions. So whether that's top secret clearance, flight status, weapons bearing status, PRP, all these other kind of special statuses that we have within the military. And so in that respect, the clear message is that, in most cases, almost all cases, seeking out mental health care actually maintains a person's career success and stability over time. Where I think the DoD has more work to do is that, unfortunately, sometimes the decisions around duty limiting conditions and statuses are oftentimes placed in the hands of leadership and commanders. And sometimes there are, unfortunately, some leaders and commanders who perhaps don't handle things as appropriately as they could, and can take away someone's clearance or their status, which can have these other sort of downstream effects. And so that's really where I think a lot of the work needs to be done still, is really kind of working to make sure that the military is selecting the right leaders to put them into positions and to help them to make decisions that are going to facilitate the success of their subordinates when they're going through, kind of the natural ebb and flow of life that many of us experience.
And I think, and I would add one thing to what Dr. Bryan said, David, that on the veteran side, so that extends from active duty to veteran status. You and I have talked a little bit about this and the need for legislative changes around disability determination, access to care, and the related complication of financial incentives and how that system is built. And that there are real problems in the way that the system is built for the provision of care for veterans that potentially limits the ability to recover in the long term around disability status. And those are all things that need careful thought and consideration on the veteran side to build on what DOD is doing with active duty as well. So there's a full continuum here, I think, that we've got opportunity for progress.
And just that, I'm glad you brought that up. That is something that we are actually making progress on. We're working with the Senate and Congress both right now, just trying to, guide them into, okay, here's some things we want to look at. Dr. Rudd, you and I have talked a bunch of times about, anybody getting out of the military who wants to become a cop can't go through the PTSD process. That's just going to be a disqualifier. As wonderful as we want to be, that'll kill them from that application. So, we're trying to get ways where they don't need to be diagnosed anymore. Let's give them the treatment anyway, get them better, and then they're ready for that future. So
I would punctuate when you say that. I'd love to, Craig's more in tune with these latest studies, but I'm not aware of any studies that haven't discovered the quicker you can get into treatment, the more effective and likely the outcome. I mean, is that pretty accurate, Craig?
Yeah, there's really good data showing that, the faster someone engages or initiates mental health treatment, especially within the context of PTSD, the better the results are. And a lot of the movement now, including what we're doing here at Ohio State, we're even getting faster treatment protocols. And so, we're pretty routinely providing, what we call masked or compressed treatment, where instead of coming in and meeting with a therapist once a week for months or longer for treatment, we sort of block off 2 weeks and meet every single day for an hour and compress the therapy into a very, very short time frame. And there's an abundance of data now, and an explosion of studies in the past few years are showing this is actually an incredibly effective way to treat PTSD. It might actually be better than the way that we've historically treated PTSD, which is weekly, kind of these spaced therapy sessions. And the reason it seems to be so much more effective is because people stay in treatment. It's, if you only have 2 weeks that you can focus on treatment, life is less likely to get in the way. And so we find the dropout that you were alluding to before is greatly reduced in these masked protocols. And similar to, we use an antibiotic metaphor. It's like, when you take an antibiotic, you take the whole dose. Like, even if you start feeling better, keep taking the antibiotic to make sure that you can get rid of the infection. It's the same way with trauma therapy. Let's do the whole thing. Let's hit it with the full dose, because that's the greatest predictor of long-term recovery. And it's easier to do that if you're just taking 2 weeks to focus on treatment than it is when you're trying to squeeze it in between work and kids and school and all the other things that we do in life.
And given and so part of the argument, and Craig, I would suggest this is a part of the argument that needs to be made in DC, Dave, is that given that accumulation of data and that consistency of finding, that ought to be taken into consideration prior to this notion of disability determination, quick access and allowing uniform access and creating mechanisms of access that allow that kind of treatment option before we find individuals ending up in permanent disability status and the kind of chronicity of problems that we see today. You think about all of those implications, not just in terms of quality of life, but there are remarkably significant financial implications as well that ought to be discussed and ought to be factored into that. So that ought to be a real significant talking point and discussion point in our next trip to DC around these kind of issues.
So, okay, I'm a commander sitting in Alaska, for example, and I've got 5 or 10 guys and girls, what have you, who I'm worried about. Dr. Bryan, you mentioned, I know we've got a couple of programs to talk about, BCBT, Strive, Edge. Are these programs that I can send my sergeant through, I think he's dealing with PTSD? Can they reach out to you while they're still active and go through that program?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so we've had plenty of active duty service members. We have Guard reservists as well, who go through our programs. And in some cases, we've had some military units who have become great partners with us. So like, put someone on PTDY or con leave or, some other kind of status that allows the service member for that 2-week period to basically be fully engaged in treatment. And it's based on a model very similar to, if you have you break your leg or you have an injury like that, you might be put on, restricted duty for a couple of weeks and you just focus on recovery. And we want to do the same thing for mental health. And so it's very easy for commanders can certainly encourage their people to reach out to us, but service members can look us up online. We get emails from active duty service members all the time saying, hey, I heard about your program and I think I'd like to participate. And we usually just schedule, therapy sessions and other activities around the duty day. And so whether that's in the afternoon or evening after they get off work, or sometimes in the morning before they head in to work. So we're always working with everyone to make it work for them.
Okay, so let's get dialed down a little bit before we move on. What is BCBT? Dr. Red, you want to?
Yeah, sure. BCBT is brief cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention. It's a protocol, a treatment protocol that Craig and I worked on over a number of years. And it's a brief, relatively brief treatment. It's a 12-session treatment that actually, if you look at the way it can be delivered in a shorter period of time. We've done adaptations on the inpatient side that are just 4 hours long, 4 sessions in terms of intervention. That's the treatment that's used in the digital therapeutic that I mentioned to you, and the app that is currently being tested in the FDA trial, and we're getting ready to launch a new trial in primary care on that. But it's a brief treatment that's had significant effect in terms of reduction of post-treatment suicide attempt rates and has been very effective. And it's one that I would certainly encourage people to use. Has as strong empirical support, arguably, as anything that's out there. And I don't know, Craig, anything you want to add to that? Did that cover it, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of in the spirit of what we've been talking about before, we've been working on finding ways to adapt the treatment to make it work better. So, Dr. Rudd mentioned the kind of the 4-session version of it that was adapted for inpatient settings. We're doing now adaptations for this virtual delivery platform, which is interesting. Over the past few years with COVID, there was a lot of anxiety in the mental health community about delivering therapy to acutely suicidal patients because there wasn't any studies on it. And so, one of the first things that we did when we moved here to the Ohio State a couple of years ago, we're like, okay, we're going to start a study. And so we now have some preliminary data that we can prevent suicide through virtual therapy. We're doing right now a masked version of it as well. We're doing the 2-week option. We're collecting data to see how that goes. And then one of the other members of my team, she's been adapting the therapy protocol specifically for people with disabilities who have mobility limitations, vision impairment. And so they can't hold the worksheets. They can't see the worksheets. And so we're making adaptations for people who might have different medical or health conditions that might otherwise limit their ability to fully engage in the treatment. And the data, she just shared some of her first phase results, and they're amazing. She's, in essence, it's the first treatment that's actually been used with people who have disabilities and shown to actually prevent their suicide risk.
Now,
And I would add to that, Dave, just one more point. Craig had mentioned the adaptations. We've got some discussions next week with some folks in the UK on adaptation for elderly. that protocol needs to be adapted to really be used with elderly that have end of life issues. And then we are going to initiate an adaptation around substance use disorders. So people that have had suicidality with significant challenges in substance use. I would argue that it currently addresses some of that, but this would really be specific to people where the substance abuse problem is arguably one of the primary problems in addition to the suicide risk.
And that was my last question as far as what can a senior leader do? Is there any opportunity for, I'm a base commander, can I get involved in any of your trials or pilots or studies? I mean, is there anything going on that Alaska Wainwright, for example, could jump into?
My answer to that would be yes. Craig, you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I said, yeah, what Dr. Rudd and I have learned is one of the hardest parts about testing these and figuring out for the military is finding good partners. And so a key part of it is, having those commanders who are willing to invite us to give us access to the base, give us an office, and work hand in hand with us. That has always been the linchpin of success. And we're always welcome to any of those invitations.
And that's it, so on that note, we'll move on, but if you have any questions, commanders, I know we've got the Navy's senior suicide prevention folks, just reach out to myself, Dr. Rudd, Dr. Bryan, we'll put you in touch with them if you'd like to be part of it. Okay, we kind of covered this. Oh, I know what we want to talk about is leadership language. We've seen a lot of examples here of late, and I'm not pointing any fingers, not saying anything. How damaging is the wrong language from a leader when we're talking about somebody who may be having suicidal ideations?
Well, it'd be interesting to hear Craig's thoughts, particularly given his recent engagements and visits to installations. I would argue it's critical. It's always been critical. Language is really important. Stigma is embedded in language. The whole idea about how we define weakness, how we define sensitivity. I mean, our language is a part of the problem. And so it's really important to be careful and thoughtful about language that's employed when we try to help people that are hesitant for care and treatment, help people that are hesitant to reach out for assistance when they're having trouble, even if they don't need professional treatment. Language is really a critical issue in that. I would argue we're not thoughtful enough about it and careful enough about it, and sometimes underestimate the impact of it because it's ultimately up to individual interpretation when you try to communicate, and that's a central issue.
And it's got to be a tough issue because it is warrior life. I mean, we are warriors, but on the other hand, we're trying to help. So I think figuring out that line has to be a trick for commanders. Where can I, the whole you break someone down to build them back up in boot camp, or any special operations training work that way. That's what I think everybody's struggling with. And I know there have been some examples lately that were just far over that line, but I think most, and that's what we might want to help them with, is figuring out, okay, here's where the things we want to be a little bit more careful with, and maybe give them some help that way if that's possible. Next question, I know you guys are going to like, what is the biggest impediment to the military having successful suicide prevention programs? I know, Dr. Rudd, you've dealt with the command change as, tell us a bit about that problem.
Yeah, I would like to, Craig, I'm going to defer to you. You've had some recent visits and exchanges that are probably much more up to date in terms of that active effort. Would love to hear your thoughts first.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that stands out to me is really sort of organizational kind of dynamics, policies, and even traditions. And what strikes me about the DoD of late, one of the biggest challenges I think that they have is that there are these sort of traditions, one of which is frequent turnover of leadership that I think serves in many respects as one of the biggest barriers, because if you figure the typical sort of life course of a commander at an installation is maybe 2 to 3 years on average. It takes several months just to kind of get to know people, to understand how things work. And then you start kind of putting into place your own, personal agenda or objectives. And then, pretty soon after you've started your own work, you guys start getting ready to move on, to go somewhere else. And so I think that is one sort of institutional barrier that we have underappreciated. And when you think of a problem as complex as suicide, this is not an issue that can be fixed, with just a few months of attention. It's more of like a marathon. You have to continually, perpetually evaluate what you're doing, update your information. And when you think of a complexity like suicide, one of the frustrating parts about something like suicide, I've used the term wicked problem to describe it, is that an intervention, when you do something to try to fix part of the problem, it oftentimes the problem changes such that the thing that initially works stops working. And then it creates a problem somewhere else, a new problem that wasn't there before. And so when you have leaders and programs that are constantly changing, you never really kind of get the continuity that is really needed to really focus on the issue. And so I think that's kind of one issue. And the other impact of frequent turnover of leadership in the military is that it creates consistent instability and unpredictability within the organization. And so there's, a sort of a mantra that you hear in the military, which is like the only thing you can count on is that you can't count on anything, right? And so the research we've been doing has shown that uncertainty and unpredictability about life is actually a significant risk factor for suicide. Because if you don't know what's going to happen, you can't count on the future. You don't really have anything to kind of place your bets on. In essence, when a problem arises, you don't have confidence that you have the capacity or resources or support to solve the problem. And so suicide might become a more viable alternative as a result. And so this sort of instability that now characterizes the day-to-day life of the military, I think, is creating a lot of stress. And one last point is when you layer that on top of what we were talking about before, sort of the evolution of society, we live in a time where families are different from what they used to be. Expectations for career, employment, growth, personal meaningfulness that one derives from one's work. All of these things are different, and they don't necessarily line up with this high turnover that very much defines the military life.
And Dave, let me add. I think that's a really nice summary of these. Let me give you a practical. Just a practical example of what that would look like. And so you take most of the clinical trials that Craig and I have been involved in over the years, they take 4 to 5 years to really get adequate follow-up data, to be able to publish and implement and know whether or not something is effective. In the build-up to start a clinical trial, you usually have one commander. When you initiate, by the time you get ready to initiate the trial, it's a second commander. And by the time you've finished it up, you're likely going to see your third commander at that installation just in the course of one trial. And there's a lack of, as you and I have talked about before, there's a lack of institutional memory about those efforts and a lack of distillation of them into a central resource. So you don't see implementation of what are very effective programs sometimes because of that turnover. And so if we can go through 3 commanders in one clinical trial, you're going to have a real difficult time in terms of secondary implementation of whatever you find when it's useful. And I would argue that that's been a significant challenge for DOD. They've invested millions and millions of dollars, done a wonderful job supporting this effort. Yet the implementation side has probably been lacking because of that. And that's just a dynamic, an institutional dynamic. It's not anybody single responsibility. It's just the nature of how an institution functions.
All right. Well, thank you both for that. I kind of figured that, but I wanted to get it from you guys. Dr. Bryan, you're going to love this next question. Gatekeeper versus peer on the suicide prevention, and or more, I think that question defines itself more resilient than suicide prevention. What is the difference? And which one would you suggest at this day and time that we start moving forward with?
Yeah, so the concept of like a gatekeeper, especially within the kind of the realm of suicide prevention, is this is someone that you typically are training to serve as almost like a first responder, so to speak. And so gatekeeper training, there's lots and lots of different gatekeeper trainings available, from the commercial sector, but within the military, I would argue things like the ACE training, ASK training, things like that constitute gatekeeper training, where in essence we say, here's a bunch of warning signs, and refer people to mental health once you've identified those who are at risk. And so you're kind of a refer and identify type of person. The peer support model has an element of the gatekeeper type of training, but there's more, I think, empowerment and responsibility placed in the peers, where, for instance, when we were doing a peer mentoring project with the Air Force over the past several years, we were actually training many of the identified peer specialists on how to intervene with people in crisis. And it was because we were hearing from like NCOs and CGOs, like, hey, I did all the stuff I was taught to do. I asked the question, and I had this subordinate who said, yeah, I'm thinking about killing myself. But there was a wait time at behavioral health, or it was a weekend, and like there was no one in the office. And so what was I supposed to do? And so we, in essence, empowered those individuals, and we taught them how to do things like crisis response planning. We're currently right now working with the National Guard to do a pilot project on empowering peers within the units to talk with their colleagues and friends about secure firearm storage. And what we find is that the advantage of the peer model is that it lends a credibility that I think that the gatekeeper trainings aren't able to fully capture. I was really struck when we were doing this training in firearm secure storage in Georgia. I think it was last week or the weekend before. It was absolutely fantastic. We had 50 soldiers in the room, and we had gone through this training. And here's how to talk with your friends about how they lock up and store their personal firearms. And at one point, they were all kind of, during the practice, they were sitting around and they were like showing each other pictures of their guns and their locking devices, and they were talking about, hey, here's the safe that I have. What kind of safe do you have? Oh, I can't afford a safe. Well, hey, have you looked at this like clamshell case? And it was like, in that moment, you could really see the power of these conversations peer to peer that I think, a trained gatekeeper just doesn't have the street cred, doesn't have the trust in that same way to be able to influence one another. And so we think there's a great potential within the peer support model that I think could be incredibly powerful for the military.
Yeah, and I would really, I would emphasize as well, Dave, that when you look at that description that Dr. Bryan offered, I mean, there's a reality of a certain level of emotional intimacy in revealing risk or talking about risk, and that peer-to-peer really allows a context that has that kind of credibility, as he said. And you just gatekeeper, it almost in some ways, I think there is some pushback around gatekeeper training that is kind of an oversight mechanism that sometimes is misinterpreted, that it doesn't have that kind of credibility and intimacy that allows natural transition. That example of the conversation is just a wonderful one. I mean, that's where people aren't feeling defensive and are readily engaged. That's what changes behavior. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that has enduring impact, and we ought to be doing more of.
Well, that sounds like something that's I think the military would have a great interest in, because you're right. And gatekeeper, you're going to your E6, E7, E8, where if I'm understanding, peer-to-peer is more literally my peer, which may be an E3, E4, correct?
Yeah, it could be. And actually, I mean, when we were doing this project with the Air Force, the way that we identified peers, we had these surveys that we would field to the entire community, and we just asked a question at the end. We kind of said, here's the kind of person we're looking for: someone who's trustworthy, someone that you feel you can approach, they're honest, you feel comfortable talking about if you had a problem. And so we got nominations from the community. And then what we did is we reviewed those, we consulted with command about that, and we were able to select out. And interestingly, what we found was that was an incredibly effective strategy. We did incidentally have a few peers who got into the program without that channel, without that sort of vetting process, and they didn't do as well. And so there's a lot to be said, right, about just asking people, who do you trust? Who's the person you go to when you have a problem? And let's tap them on the shoulder and let's give them what they need to empower them, so that if by chance you or somebody else comes and you're having a really bad day, that person now has the tools and the knowledge that they need to actually take a step forward, intervene, and potentially save a life.
Yeah, and Dave, Dave, that is such a critical point that Craig just gave you a nice example of, about actually talking to people about what they're willing to do and what's effective. I mean, if you look at BCBT specifically, there have been multiple iterations of that approach to treatment. They've been modified by feedback from patients. And I would argue the same thing about PTSD treatment, that it's been modified by feedback from patients and looking at what's effective, what is not, and actively engaging and partnering with people, rather than having an approach that's kind of top down and saying, this is what should work for you. It's really knowing what works for people, because you engage with them, talk with them about what works, what matters, and what seems to make a difference and what seems to make it more difficult. That we have not done enough of over the years. I think we're doing a lot more of that now. And as a result, we're having more impact. And sometimes it's around very simple things. And these are not complex ideas.
Yeah, well, I know, I can tell you that we are hoping as an organization to bring your trainers out, Dr. Bryan, to do work with our local Air Force base who's really interested in the peer-to-peer side of the training. So that's so exciting to me that, we might even be involved in this very early stage. Dr. Rudd, I know you'd mentioned that you're going to be running out of time. How are you? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, Dave, I'm going to have to jump off here in a minute. If you've got anything you want me to address real quickly, I'm going to have to disengage. I apologize.
Oh, no problem. All right. So if anybody has any specific questions for Dr. Rudd, we have a minute here submitted through our chat, and we'll try to get it based on his time. Otherwise, Dr. Bryan and myself will continue the conversation.
Sounds good. And I would encourage you, Dave, look forward to talking with both of you more about spending some time in Washington, talking more broadly about policies, and particularly at the post-active duty level, at the VA level, where those policies have implications for comparable number of lives for long periods of time. And a lot of this has implications for that work. And Dave, really appreciate the work you're doing. And Craig, always appreciate the work you're doing and the impact you're having. And it's great talking to and seeing both of you guys. You guys take care.
All right. Thank you.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
All right, Dr. Bryan. So now, rethinking suicide. I mean, we just encapsulated that book in what we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes anyway. A lot of awesome reviews, a lot of people, and I do want to stress to, our commanders out there, if you haven't read the book, Rethinking Suicide, it is so perfectly named. It's looking at it from a almost different set of eyes than we've done in the past. And I would just suggest anybody reads that who has a chance. Dr. Bryan, tell us a little bit about some of the real key parts of the book and what made you write it. I mean, that was a big step, writing that. Yeah.
So it's, I wrote the book. I mean, kind of the motive was really just, ideas and thoughts that, I'd been contemplating over the years. And my military service had a pretty profound effect on my thinking of suicide. And so I talk about at the beginning of the book my experiences in Iraq and really confronting the realities of suicide head on. And it was the first time basically that I confronted dead bodies, people who had actually shot themselves. And before that, suicide was something that kind of happened somewhere else, right? And just kind of coming face to face with that reality was pretty transformative for me. And I started to really kind of think as I encountered these sort of circumstances that didn't really fit what I had been taught about suicide, and started questioning, are we right about this, or are we wrong? And maybe part of the reason we're not better at this is that many of our core assumptions are fundamentally flawed. And so we talked about already, the role of mental health issues, and maybe not all suicides are driven by mental health problems. And we've talked a little bit about quality of life issues, which is something else that I take on in the book, and say of how it's not just, we conceptualize suicide as like something that a person has, like it's a trait inside of them, when, in my experience and the research that I do, I've been struck by how much suicide risk is impacted by the environment, by the relationships that we have, but also by things like housing issues, living wages, resources within the environment. And so perhaps part of the reason we've not been better at suicide prevention is we keep focusing on the person, and looking at this as we got to figure out who's going to kill themselves and what's wrong with them and try to stop them, when we might actually be successful if we looked more broadly and said that there are things that happen in life all around us that influence whether or not life is even worth living. And if we can create lives that are worth living, when people experience stress, they're perhaps going to be more likely to hit the brakes and say, no, I'm not going to kill myself. I'll stay alive, because there are good things in life as well. And so that really, I think, is kind of the underlying core argument of the book, is that we should broaden our perspective and be much more comprehensive in how we think about and approach suicide prevention.
And I know one thing that I really like about your work, and I hope we talk about quite a bit actually, is the importance of a safety plan. And I'm not just talking about the simple one where we write a couple things down. As far as for a commander goes, how should that commander make a safety plan for his people? The people that he's at risk for. Yeah.
So for those not familiar, so the term safety planning refers to an intervention that Dr. Rudd and I have been studying for many years. We use another term, it's called crisis response planning. And so crisis response planning, or CRP, kind of served as the sort of early ancestor of what's now often referred to as safety planning. And a key part of it is sitting down with someone and, in a personal one-on-one conversation, saying, tell me what's going on in your life. How did you get from point A to point B, where you're really overwhelmed, stressed out? Maybe you're thinking about killing yourself, or in some cases you've tried to kill yourself. And how can we now develop this sort of little checklist of first knowing when you're upset? How would you know that you're heading down this road? And then once we can identify those flags or those warning signs, what are you going to do about it? And so we identify these simple strategies that a person can follow to help them calm down, to distract themselves. We've done a lot of research, including things around reasons for living and purpose. So to help remember and refresh your memory when you're stressed out, what is good about life, what is worth living for, and then also identifying various sources of social support who we can reach out to get outside assistance. And the research we've done shows that this reduces suicide attempts enormously by 76% amongst military personnel. We have newer data. We've not published it yet, but I'll kind of give you all this sneak peek here in the audience. One of our 2-week treatment programs for PTSD that we've been talking about, we integrated crisis response planning into it. And what we found was that when service members and veterans received that crisis response plan, their suicidal ideation plummeted within a week. It took longer for the other veterans and service members to kind of catch up. And so we're just finding all of this data now that this really simple strategy, and we typically just handwrite it on an index card in 30 minutes or less, is incredibly potent for reducing suicidal thoughts and suicidal behavior.
So the actual safety plan is for me, the person with ideations, as much as it's for a clinician to know who to call and who to get help.
Yeah, and it's personalized to the individual, and that's kind of the key. And so, I'm asked a lot, well, could we get a formation, give her, 200 people in the formation an index card and make them write this? I was like, well, you could do that. I don't think it would work though, because there isn't that sort of personalization that seems to be so key. And it really is sort of that ability to form a relationship with someone, understand what they're going through, and then to help guide that person to come up with a customized plan. And this is incidentally part of what we were training those peer mentors to do. Up until our work, it was mostly kind of like, oh, you do this with doctors and therapists and counselors. And what we realized was that, no, it's friends, it's family members, it's people in the community. That's who a service member and veteran is most likely to turn to. And so we need to empower everyone to have these conversations and to help someone just kind of remember. It's just kind of a memory aid of what to do when you're feeling overwhelmed.
You mentioned stigma a couple times, and this is for me one of my pet peeve areas, is that we seem to be going overboard on destigmatizing suicide. I mean, no matter how we want to color code it, suicide is bad. I mean, that is just simple. And with us, with everybody's commands saying, hey, we don't want to say that, I think we're opening people up. We're giving them kind of a roadmap to make it easier. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think we have really focused so much on anti-stigma, and it's sort of like we're trying to convince people to go and get help, and that's only just one piece of the puzzle, though. And the part that we've also, I feel that we've often missed is things like the logistics of help seeking, the convenience. How much does it cost? What time is the clinic open? Is there a clinic close by? Does a therapist know how to effectively treat my condition? But also the effectiveness of those services. We talked it's probably been an hour now since we talked about this earlier, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about which treatments are best, which treatments are perhaps less helpful for different conditions. And so I find that many service members and veterans sort of like, it's almost like they don't know what to ask for and what to look for. And you just kind of get whatever that person sitting in the office just happens to know, when there actually might be treatment options that are very clearly better than what's available. And these are the other parts of stigma that we've neglected, because if someone believes, if I go and get help, that says something bad about me, I don't want to be seen as weak, other, kind of common aspects of stigma, it's easier to overcome that barrier if you believe the help is actually going to work and it's going to be easy and convenient. If, however, that treatment, you don't have a lot of confidence in it, it's expensive, I can't get to it, it's, a pain in the butt, why would I go through the hassle of overcoming my stigma? And so I really have argued that we need to do more to really emphasize these other critical aspects of help seeking, which is that here are the things that work best, and here's how to make it as easy as possible for people to access those effective cares.
Because I mean, the one thing that is changed now over 15 years ago is there are a ton of very effective programs through the different universities. Yeah. I know Stop Soldier Suicide does a really good job at that initial crisis. So there's a lot of programs, and if anybody has questions, especially, our senior leaders about where to go, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll get you a whole list.
And I'll add, Dave, one of the other interesting things about the anti-stigma efforts, there's actually a pretty good, I think, reason to suspect that most of the anti-stigma campaigns have largely worked. And I say that because when we talk with younger generations now, so, adolescents to early adults, kind of that 16 to 25-year-old, which of course is kind of the prime age for most active duty service members. When you kind of talk with them about mental health services, they are way more likely than older generations to say, well, yeah, of course you go to mental health. That's just a part of good health. And so interestingly, one of the things we think that might be contributing to strain on behavioral health services within the DoD and also society more broadly is there has been a cultural shift where younger generations are now raising their hand and saying, I want to go because this is just a part of good health. And we haven't yet plussed up the amount of professionals. And so there's this demand supply imbalance as a result. And so in that sense, it's kind of like, well, all of our messaging for many, many years, I think, is taking hold. And now we need to make sure that they have access to those highly effective treatments.
It sounds like a triage situation because of that very fact.
It is. And I think, one of the other interesting things I've observed in the DoD of late is, the emphasis on, anti-stigma mental health services has, kind of generalized to the point that now people are coming forward for help for things that are not mental health related issues. So financial strain, relationship problems, things like that. So they're stressful, right? So these are things people are, worried, they're stressed out, but they're not necessarily health conditions per se. They're kind of just, we all experience these forms of stress. And so related to the triage issue is, I think we also need to start improving our messaging to say that, for instance, if you're having financial strain, actually probably a really good place to go would be to a financial consultant through Army Community Services, the Fleet and Family Support Services, those types of organizations where in essence, maybe mental health is not the first stop for those types of problems. These other life support types of agencies might be the best place to go.
And I know that all the different state guard units have a financial consultant on their payroll. I mean, they're
financial consultants, the family support personnel, child development centers. The military has a lot of MFLACs, military family life consultants. And so there are actually a lot of support services and agencies that are not within the healthcare system that can actually be incredibly beneficial for many service members who are experiencing stress related to these sort of everyday life problems like debt, credit card problems, finances, and so on.
Well, and that sounds an answer to the question of what can senior military leaders do. That's an answer right there. Just compile a list. Here's who our financial counselor is. Here's who are married. That way we start taking a little bit of that burden off mental health and put it where it belongs.
Yeah, I think so. And I know that there have been some efforts in the DoD of late to kind of create these sort of improved triage systems. I know the Air Force, for instance, has been working on some of this. I can't remember the name of the program now, but they pilot tested this, where in essence, if someone comes forward, say to a mental health clinic, before they do a formal intake and sort of bring them into the healthcare system, what they do is sit down with the service member and say what's going on, so that if it is a relationship problem, financial strain, something that could be much more quickly addressed by some of these other community agencies, they can kind of redirect people, get them connected to the right help at the right time. And they found that that's actually been quite successful, and that could have this downstream effect of then shortening the wait time to get into mental health services. And so I think those types of approaches are going to be really key.
And another one, I don't know if you're going to agree with me on this, but another resource that's phenomenal to me is the chaplaincy. I mean, they really are not, granted, it's not for everybody, But I think it even can be because they are so non-denominational now that, while they may talk spirituality a little bit,
Yeah.
it's not, they're really a good buffer, especially if you're waiting for mental health or, and I know one of the things that we hear a lot is if I tell a chaplain something, it goes straight from there to my commander, which is 100% wrong. That chaplain by law can't reveal that. And I only say that so in case somebody, is listening right now, is wondering about that, you can count on talking to your chaplain about that. They cannot tell anything. And so, sorry, Dr. Bryan, you go on. I know you're about to say something.
Yeah, no, I was gonna agree. And I've met with many chaplains over the past couple of years, and one of the things that they've expressed concern about is that perhaps their role has been diminished of late and kind of seen as not as important in supporting the well-being and quality of life of service members. And I think you're absolutely right that the chaplains can be a great resource for some service members, and oftentimes can be sort of a kind of a key first line of defense. I'm aware of some bases that have even kind of tried to leverage their chaplain staff much more effectively by integrating them within behavioral health clinics, for instance, so that again, if someone comes in for like a mental health appointment, something like that, and based on the conversation of what's going on with the person's life, they might have an option is like, well, maybe actually meeting with a chaplain would be a better option for that person than engaging in mental health care. And so that sort of interdisciplinary collaboration that really undermines the stovepiping and the territorialism that sometimes happens in large organizations, I think is going to be really, really impactful for preventing suicide.
Now, here's a question I could ask you earlier, but I forgot about. How much do you think, you can go from base to base, and like we were talking about earlier, they may have completely different programs, ways of dealing with ideations. How much do you think that's hurting our service members and even veterans? Same thing in the veteran community.
Yeah, to clarify how much like differences in programs might be affecting things.
Yeah, I mean, if you're especially like within the Guard, you can go to California Guard and they've got these great programs where another one may have almost none. I mean, and it's that huge of a variation.
Yeah, the inconsistencies are really challenging because different states, different regions have different resources available. And when you think of like the National Guard in particular, that's going to be funded by the state and supported by the state. And so kind of depending on the financial health and stability of each state government, that can have severe implications for what's available to their personnel. But it also, I think, reflects sometimes different cultures that characterize different states where, mental health services and other support services perhaps have differential value in different parts of the country.
Okay. So overall, I guess we're not, for some reason, our questions, I haven't seen any. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and start submitting them now, and we'll read them. We have one that asked if the sound's on. I hope so.
Yes, it looks like we've got a few that have come in that we could.
I'm looking at them. Our SRs higher technology field than other fields?
So I think I'm assuming the question SR stands for suicide rates. And I've not seen that the career fields that seem to have the highest suicide rates. Well, I guess this is going to be in the general population, not military specific, but we see like medical fields, but also like construction and fields that have high physical labor tend to have higher suicide rates. Within the military, the professions that seem to have higher rates are like infantry as well as maneuver combat arms professions. And so EOD has kind of also had traditionally higher rates. And so what I think that means from a prevention perspective is that we probably need to do a better job of customizing interventions and strategies to the unique needs of these different subgroups. Something that I often say is that one size fits all often means one size fits nobody. And unfortunately, a large agency like DoD kind of tries to do the one size fits all approach when maybe there can be better impact by allowing the different subcultures within the organization to customize programming to their unique needs.
But do you think there should be a minimum, similar to physical health, a minimum standard that goes across the DoD, and then we can go beyond that?
Yeah. So this is, the term that's often used, within our field is like what's called principle-based care or principles-based interventions. And the idea is here, like, what's the core idea? Like, here's the concept, and that needs to be retained. That needs to be standardized. But how you deliver that concept might differ based upon the unique needs of the community that you're trying to work with. So, for example, how I talk to, say, a security forces squadron with law enforcement officers would probably be very different than how I would talk to a medical unit. So it might still be the same concept, but the language that I use, the metaphors, should be tailored to the unique needs of each of those communities.
So we do need to have some variation for sure then.
I think so. And again, I think it's adapting the core concept to the unique circumstances and needs of those different groups.
I got you. All right, here's a good question. Are the actions and attention DoD and the services are taking making a difference in suicide rates? I know the DoD just released their report here last month, and they had, a fairly substantial decrease for the first time in a long time.
Yeah.
And, what do you credit that to?
Well, I exercise caution. I think one of the big mistakes that we are traps that we've gotten ourselves in, I think, I'll be frank, I think Congress falls into this trap more than anybody else, which is focusing on like short-term changes. So how does this year compare to last year? And so, so now the headlines are, the suicide rate dropped by whatever percent relative to last year. The headlines last year were about how the suicide rate increased by a certain percent relative to the year before that. And then the year before that, it was down. And it's because the rates oftentimes kind of fluctuate up and down. And so it's sort of like trying to make a statement about seasons or climate by focusing on the temperature on an hourly basis wherever you live. So probably most of us in the United States a few weeks ago, that winter storm that kind of swept across the country and hit all of us to some extent. I know here in Central Ohio, the temperature dropped 40 degrees within just a few hours. And then about a week later, the temperature went back up. If I had just focused on that 40-degree drop within a few hours, that gives me absolutely no information whatsoever about overall seasonal patterns within temperature and weather and things like that. And so I think we need to resist the temptation to keep focusing on quarter to quarter, month to month, year to year types of changes, because the overall trend, the overall pattern has been that the suicide rates are elevated. They remain elevated, and they might actually still be trending upward. And so I, maybe I'm just being a pessimist, but I think we've had too many, good news stories over the past several years that I think cause us to take our eye off the ball and not stick to programs, strategies that might actually be helpful because we give up on them too soon.
You said it earlier, antibiotics. Perfect example.
Yep,
we get better, we stop, and then we end up being sick again.
Very much so.
Yep. All right. So, well, we know a lot of the programs that the military, I think, is doing a really good job now. Be it extending boot camp to get trainings in. They're really going head forward on creating programs. Their force has, what is it? Fortify the Force, and the other one, Total Warrior. And that's a lot of what you're talking about is being there for each other, mental health, physical health, all the health. So I think the answer to that question is at least a fairly conservative. Yes, we are making progress, but I agree with you. We've seen these numbers come out one day saying it's great, and then the next day we have this huge rash of suicides that just blows it.
Well, and I think, there's a lot to be said about, playing the long game with this. And I'm reflecting, we've talked about Alaska a lot because they've received a lot of attention. And so suicide rates have, been greatly reduced in the past year in Alaska relative to the preceding years. And I was up in Alaska in October, and it was like right before I arrived. Unfortunately, there were like 3 suicides within a very short period of time. And I remember talking with some of the leaders up there, and they're like, well, maybe we're not doing a good job. Maybe we should stop. What are we doing wrong? And, to kind of sit there and say, I don't think it's reasonable to say we had this cluster of suicides within 1 month when it seems like things have changed. And so maybe let's not change. Let's kind of stick to the program. Let's see what's happening, because I think we need more time to really see how things are going to take hold. And I sort of like wish I could communicate that more broadly to military leadership, to Congress, to others. Like sometimes we just need to not react. Sometimes doing something might actually be worse than doing nothing. And we need sometimes to be a little bit more deliberate and focus on the principles. What's the core concept that we want to achieve, and not necessarily get distracted by the jitters in the data, which is just kind of a natural part of how we track and monitor outcomes.
Okay, let's move on to a topic I know you're very fond of: lethal means, or actually we'll call it safe storage, safe handling. You're talking about different trainings you have now. That's exciting that I wasn't even aware of. So tell me a little bit about the training. What is it? What's the primary purpose? How does it work?
Yeah, so the idea behind this, we're increasingly focused on the role of firearms, and this is motivated by kind of a shift in our perspective. So consistent with the book that I had written on rethinking suicide, where historically we've been asking the question, why do people die by suicide? And what I would argue is there is no answer to that question, and it's because why someone attempts suicide, dies by suicide, that answer can actually be different for different people. And it's that question, why, is just as difficult, if not impossible, to answer as the question, why do people die in car crashes? There is no single answer. And so instead, let's look at asking the question, how do people die by suicide? And one of the answers to that, an overwhelming trend in the military and veteran communities, is firearms. So about 2/3 of all suicides amongst military personnel and veterans are due to firearms. We see a higher rate in the National Guard. It's closer to about 80% of National Guard personnel use a firearm to kill themselves. And so it's really hard to talk about suicide prevention meaningfully if we're not talking about the role that firearms play. And one of the key findings is that easy access to loaded weapons is actually one of the strongest determinants of the lethality of a suicide attempt. And so taking steps like use of locking devices, kind of placing those safety precautions into place, has actually been shown to reduce suicide rates. And so we're increasingly focused on talking about this amongst military personnel and veterans to say, how are you storing your weapons? And how can we adopt a more safety, secure storage mindset as a different way to prevent suicide, especially amongst those who are gun owners?
How long is that training the one you did? I mean, how many hours wise?
Yeah, so we've done the ones that we've been doing of late are typically between 3 to 4 hours long. So there's kind of a part where we explain the rationale, because what we found is that this is not how most people have been thinking about suicide prevention. It's all about mental health and warning signs and going to treatment. But again, we know that there's a significant percentage of people who get upset really fast. They get bad news, they have access to a loaded weapon, and then they die. And so we need a backup plan. And so we begin by talking about, like, why would we even be talking about things like firearm access? And then we spend a lot of time actually practicing. We have people pair up with each other and say, let's just talk about this. Let's see how it goes. And what we have found is overwhelmingly service members walk away from that and they say, that was eye-opening. And this is something that I've not thought of before. And I want to start having these conversations with my friends and my buddies and my loved ones.
Family, yeah.
Yeah. And they find that it's a lot easier to have these conversations than they thought, especially service members and veterans who are gun owners themselves, right? They have the street cred. And so I think that they are the best positioned individuals to make a difference here.
Maybe get your opinion on this, but maybe we look at doing one of those trainings on a scale like this, where we've got the leaders and then they can choose for their own basis to have you guys or whomever.
Yeah, I mean, we actually have been working with USAA Foundation. They've generously given us a grant here at the Ohio State to actually conduct such trainings. And so we could potentially set some of those up. And we want to, in those trainings, we actually don't want necessarily to teach this to mental health professionals. We want to teach it to
the people,
to people in the community. Because again, it's, when we go through rough patches, we turn to our friends. That's our first line. And that's really who we need to start having these conversations with.
I am my brother's keeper.
Yep.
We just got a bunch of questions coming. So
great.
Yeah. What type of changes would you offer to make in the military environment to improve quality of life?
Yeah, I think, like I mentioned before, the number one sort of frequently asked or frequently reported stressor involved IT systems. And my sense is that there's a couple of things related to it, one of which is just, the cybersecurity precautions that are in place. And so that just slows down computers. And so the kind of question becomes then, are there different ways to protect DoD systems that don't kind of interfere with day-to-day work and create all these other problems? But sometimes the equipment's just out of date. The equipment doesn't work. And so how do we fix those things? Things related to, I think, leave as well and communication within command structures. So another common complaint amongst service members of all ranks is I get text messaged by my boss after hours on weekends when I'm on leave. I never feel that I'm off duty. And so there have been some interesting efforts by some military leaders to basically have no contact rules, no text messaging after the duty day, except for emergencies. One General Beagle kind of talked about it's just training management. Don't rely on the cell phones and the apps and things like that to communicate with your people. You should be managing training and work-related things within the context of the duty day and not reaching out to people after hours. We found, I think that's another kind of small quality of life thing that could massively improve well-being within the military. And another key area is allowing people to take leave. It's shocking how many service members have use or lose leave. They're not able to take time off. Part of it is because there's kind of a military-wide sort of understaffing, shortage of personnel. But unfortunately, that's matched onto sometimes with a perspective of, because we're short-staffed, nobody can ever take any time off. And so it just kind of grinds people down. And I really think we could turn the corner here if we started addressing those types of quality of life issues, where let people take leave and far enough in advance that they're not having to pay ridiculous rates to fly to go visit family and to visit for the holidays. And when they're on leave them alone. Just leave them alone. So they can actually recharge. And those small little things, I think, could make a big difference.
And I have one too. You might laugh at me for this. Ban cell phones during trainings, exercises. People have stopped talking. We
Yeah.
talk about all the peer, but if I'm sitting there on my freaking phone and not talking, I lose that element anyway.
Well, and what's interesting is the thing about technology, like smartphones, because this is a common concern that's raised. And I sit here, I'm like, I don't know if it's the cell phone itself, right? But I think what has happened is that the advent of smartphones and things like that have changed the availability of information, the capacity and our expectations about communication. So I think of particularly younger generations, there's sort of a belief or a worldview that the speed with which you respond to a text message, an email, a snap, something like that is an indicator of how important the other person is. And I've had these conversations with my daughter when she was younger. I've had it with like the students that I've mentored, and even with other employees that if I don't respond, it might be that I'm in a meeting, or I might be, doing something where I don't have my phone. It doesn't mean that I don't care, that it's not important. And so I think that sense of urgency that comes up, then interestingly, that sort of immediate gratification has been shown to be a decision-making style that is a vulnerability for suicide. And so I think there's a cultural phenomenon related to technology where we have adopted this urgency of action mindset, which is now creeping into our lives and perhaps actually inadvertently increasing risk for suicide.
Yeah, I know. I watched it when I was on a base a couple of months ago. They got done with their drill, and they didn't even, we used to make the plans to go to the bar and have a good time.
Yeah.
Everybody there went straight to their phones, and right standing there in the middle of the drill field. And like, that's when I realized we as a military, we really need to start limiting that and forcing those connections to start again.
Well, I think I would argue if we try to limit it, we will fail. And it's in the same way that, a few decades ago, the what we now call hard lines, but the phones that we had hanging on our walls with wires and stuff like and cords. I remember my parents, saying, to my generation, you're on the phone all the time and things like that. And so I think there's always going to be, just as a natural part of evolution and technology, that there's going to be this disconnect in how people communicate. And so restricting it almost never works. But instead, it's how do we adapt to it? How do we leverage this new way of communicating in a way that can be productive and that can minimize the harms? And I think part of it is just we haven't figured out yet as an institution, perhaps even as a society, how to best use this new form of communication that's different from how many of us were raised.
Well, I know a lot of parents are banning cell phones at their dinner table completely, and then they're having their family time. And I'm not saying they need to ban it all the time, but if we don't have that human interaction.
Yeah, and I think that's, I think the lesson there is sort of, kind of setting limits on, the activities that we do. And again, I think of corollaries from when, I was growing up, and, when there were like kind of when we were with family, when we had dinner, there was an expectation that, I wouldn't be doing other activities. And so I think that's certainly appropriate to do when it's sort of designed to kind of build that cohesion and to communicate the message that you don't necessarily need this particular device or strategy, for your well-being or for, life in general, but it's a tool that we have that we can set aside at times.
And I'm a big supporter, and I think we've all seen it. The stronger the unit cohesion, the less suicides they will see. That's just simple math.
Yeah. And I think, I think that, I mean, there's a lot of data behind that, and a lot of that, interestingly, this is another place where leadership plays a big role, because leaders have a significant impact on cohesion. And so, things like transformative leadership, for instance, is sort of like a series of behaviors and actions, a style of leadership that has been shown to be incredibly good for like well-being and health. And a big part of transformative leadership is that it builds trust amongst one's subordinates. And a key strategy for building that trust is by taking time as a leader to talk about the purpose of one's activities and one's tasks. And there's actually research in the military that supports that, showing that commanders that sit down, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like sitting down on a couch or something, but taking time to regularly talk with the members of the unit. Why are we doing the things that we're doing? Why are we stationed here? I think it has a lot of relevance for some of our remote installations. Like, why are we here, and what is our purpose and role and mission? That has been shown to bolster connectedness and trust, which then protects against stress.
And I'm sure it's a simple question. Are there any of your buddies who you're concerned about?
Yeah.
And that one-on-one conversation is a great opportunity to even look into that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, here's a question you're going to like. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say there's a question that came in. Maybe it's the same one that I think is a good question.
Another safe storage question. I don't understand how this helps. Even if unloaded, locked up, trigger locked, it still takes a very short time to access if someone is intent. My answer to that is time between decision and action.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was the same question I saw. I'm glad you've flagged it as well. I wanted to make sure we answer it. This is a great question. I get asked about this all the time. And, what you said there, Dave, is kind of the crux of the idea, is that it slows a person down. We know that most suicidal crises are actually short-lived, typically a few seconds or minutes at most. And so a big part of the idea behind this is sort of like riding the wave and just keeping the person alive long enough for them to naturally start to recover and calm back down. But I think a practical way of thinking about how safe storage could prevent some, it's not going to prevent all suicides, but it will prevent some. Think of how effective it is to lock our car doors and how that prevents and deters theft and burglary. If you think about it, it's not that hard to break the window, right? But surprisingly, the simple act of locking our car door is one of the simplest things that we can do to deter a lot of unwanted outcomes. And the same is true in other areas. Think of how often we place locks on the liquor cabinet to make sure our kids don't get into it. We lock our front doors of our own homes for the same reason. And so these things, they're not going to end or prevent all actions or decisions, but it's sort of like it's inconvenient. And I wish David were still on the call, because he's used a term that I love, which is strategic inconvenience. Mm-hmm. And when a person is highly emotionally upset, the extra steps involved to unlock, load a weapon, for many will actually be just inconvenient enough to kind of stop them. And I think that's the role. And so it's very much a harm reduction model. I'm not so naive as to think it'll end every single suicide, but I think it'll stop some. And so it's just one more step that we could take in the right direction, that in combination with other strategies will accumulate and get us bigger effects.
Here's one I'm going to let you totally take. How do we measure our effectiveness when we can't really know how many suicides we prevented?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so it kind of depends on, of course, what type of program we're testing. So like some of the therapies, for instance, that we've been talking about, like BCBT, what we usually do, we use what's called like a randomized controlled trial design, where we have two different ways of doing therapy. So we typically use what's called usual care. So what is existing? What if you go to the mental health clinic today, what are you going to get? And then we compare that to the new program, the new treatment, and then we track people over time, and then we see, does one have a lower suicide attempt rate than others? Okay, so that's kind of a classic way of testing some programs, but there are other programs that are a lot harder. to test. And so they're typically different like statistical methods and designs that we can look like, for instance, if a new policy comes into effect on a certain date, does that policy then lead to a change, like a reduction in suicides? Best example of this that I think is applicable here. The Israeli military several decades ago had a suicide problem, just like we do now. And the problem that once they did their data analysis was they were finding it was young service members shooting themselves, typically on the weekend when they went home. And so the Israeli military instituted a new policy, which was that before you go home on the weekend, you have to check your weapon into the armory. You have to lock it up. Go home, do your thing, come back onto duty after the weekend's over, go to the armory, get your weapon, and then do your job. They found that policy change reduced firearm suicides by 70%, almost overnight.
Wow.
And because firearm suicides were the majority of the ways that service members were killing themselves, that one policy change led to a 40% reduction in their force-wide suicide rate. And so they weren't randomizing, right? They couldn't compare, well, we'll have some people lock up and others don't. They just said, this is how we're doing it. And that was how they were able to establish that secure firearm storage was this incredibly potent way to prevent military suicides. So it kind of goes back to a previous question as well, that there is data that simple things like locking up firearms can actually be a remarkably effective way to prevent some suicides.
Yeah, and what you're talking about, just strategic inconvenience, putting your pills up on the top of a cabinet that you have to get a ladder to get.
Well, we do strategic inconvenience all the time in our lives. I mean, how many of us have like, we have like the candy, bowl in our office, and then we go, because if you put the candy bowl on the other side of the office, you're less likely to eat the candy, even though it's in the same room, but it's inconvenient enough. There's all these sorts of things that we do to use strategic inconvenience. And so that's really kind of the idea behind secure firearm storage.
Okay, I don't know if this is one you're going to want, if you want to talk about. Can you talk about emerging evidence linking brain injuries and suicide?
Yeah, so this is kind of been a hot question for at least 2 decades now, and I guess the short answer is we don't fully understand yet, but we're starting to get better. And some of the newer things that we know right now is that there are ways that brain injury can occur that maybe isn't immediately detectable. So if you think of something like a blast injury, one of the unique things about a blast as compared to say like a football type of injury, sports injury, car crash injury, is that the blast involves air pressure change. And so our brain is actually filled with some empty spaces that have fluid in them. They're called ventricles. And when the air pressure changes, it in essence kind of squeezes our brain, and then our brain expands, right? So think of it's the same idea when you're flying on a plane and your ears pop as you change altitude because of the pressure change. And so that squeezing and flexing of the brain seems to have impacts that do not necessarily show up on like CAT scans and some of the typical imaging injury tests that we use. But newer technology like diffusion tensor imaging can sometimes see that you can like the cords, the fibers that connect our cells together. They're called axons. They're like stretched. They can sometimes be peeled back. And all these things can impact brain functioning. Some of the newer research we're doing here at Ohio State's not necessarily specific to TBI, but we are looking at brain functioning as it relates to suicide risk. And what we're finding is that some of our interventions, like crisis response planning, are actually changing brain functioning in a positive way. And so that kind of leads us to think of, how if brain injury, for instance, particularly occurs in the front of the brain, this is where things like emotion control, planning ahead tends to be localized. That can be especially increased risk for suicide. And we're trying to figure out how can we kind of maybe roll back some of those changes that occur to kind of alter how a person makes decisions and reduce their suicide risk.
Gotcha. Yeah, that stuff, when you start talking about the brain, sorry, I haven't just, I don't know, even my own, I'm lost. So There's one I know you'll want to answer right here. Okay, do you have specific information available regarding the peer trials that you've done in the Air Force? And I know we do because
Yeah, we've actually just started publishing some of the first studies from that, and so one of the big challenges we had when we were doing that first study was that, like, we started the study, and this was in January of 2020, and then COVID hit.
wow.
And so, like, no one was hanging out with each other. And so that is unfortunately one of the biggest problems we ran into, is because the whole idea behind the program was based on people interacting with each other. And so we missed almost a year of people being able to, like, fully engage. And so the second half of the study, once people were able to return to the workplace and start doing things, that's where we started to learn quite a bit more. And it was interesting because some of the feedback that we were receiving was that the trained peers were saying, like, this is different from any other training we've received. The commanders, we started getting more and more commanders who were not a part of the study saying, well, hey, we've heard about it, we want it in our unit as well. And so we have at least some good qualitative feedback that the peers kind of felt like they were able to positively impact the well-being of their colleagues. And we had many of the peers that we trained actually intervened with fellow service members who were actively suicidal. And they did a really good job of it and helped to get those people connected to mental health care.
That's awesome. And I know I have some of the data. So, anybody wants it, again, just reach out. We'll get you whatever they have. It's easy enough. Dr. Bryan, I know I promised you I'd have you out in 2 hours, and we are running out of time. I do want to say, just so everybody know, we are going to be sending out a follow-up survey. It's only 8 questions, so like 15 seconds. Please fill it out. It really helps us gauge if what we're doing helps or not. Dr. Bryan, anything else that you'd like to sign off with?
No, I just thank everyone for joining today. Happy to answer any additional follow-up questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but if you ever want more information or need additional assistance, feel free to reach out via email. So hope this was helpful.
Yeah, and if you are struggling and you're listening, please reach out to us. There's emails all over, message me directly, whatever. Let's just get you help. So that's what we're good at doing. So thank you all. We're not sure about our next one yet. We might have to postpone, but we'll update everybody. So everybody have a great day, and thank you for coming.
All right, take care.
All right, thanks.